time moves forward, relentless. It heals wounds, dismantles empires, yet carries with it a shadow that never fully dissipates. The mystery of the unsolved crime. There are acts of violence that tear the fabric of reality, and when the hand that commits them remains hidden, what is left is a cold echo, a question suspended in history. In this documentary, we seek not mere facts, but the soul of these mysteries. We will travel across more than a century, from gaslit Victorian alleys to isolated German farmhouses and winding Californian roads. We will unearth the crimes that defied logic, mocked justice, and, over a century later, continue to haunt us. They are the echoes of the unsolved. Cases where the killer became a legend, the victim became a symbol of terror, and the answer, the simplest and most terrible of truths, was lost in the fog of time. Why do some monsters manage to escape judgment? And what does the failure to resolve them say about us? Prepare yourself. The past is about to tell us its darkest secrets. Our journey begins in London, 1888, at the heart of the Industrial Revolution, where Victorian glamour concealed a brutal poverty. Gaslight barely managed to pierce the putrid fog of Whitechapel. This was the stage for the first serial predator to be immortalized by sheer terror. Between August and November 1888, 5 women, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, would be brutally murdered, all under circumstances pointing to a single, sinister hand. He was not just a killer, he was a surgical butcher. The modus operandi was chillingly cold. Precise cuts and organ removal, indicating shocking anatomical knowledge. What elevated this criminal to mythic status was his communication. The infamous letters, filled with scorn and threats, were sent to the press and police. The most famous, the "From Hell" letter, was supposedly accompanied by a preserved human kidney. He christened himself Jack the Ripper. Scotland Yard was inundated with information, but the investigation faltered. The lack of communication between police forces, the absence of modern forensic science, and the general panic created a perfect chaos. The suspects were a catalogue of mystery: Prince Albert Victor, a Polish barber named Aaron Kosminski, perhaps the physician William Gull, implicated in elite conspiracy theories? The case was never solved due to a convergence of critical failures. The absence of fingerprints as solid evidence, the contamination of the crime scenes, and, crucially, the inability to comprehend the mind of a modern serial killer. Jack simply dissolved into the London fog, leaving behind only a trail of blood and a monumental void in criminal history. Jack's legacy is profound. He forced the police to develop new techniques and initiated a cultural obsession with the serial killer. He is the archetype, the primordial shadow of urban malice. The first to transform crime into a media horror narrative. From the urban chaos of London, we travel to rural Bavaria, in 1922, for a tragedy that borders on the supernatural. The Hinterkaifeck farm was the epitome of isolation. Its inhabitants, Andreas Gruber, 63, his wife Kazilia, 72, his widowed daughter Victoria, 35, his 2 grandchildren Kazilia, 7, and Joseph, 2, and the new maid Maria Baumgartner, 44, lived apart from the world.
But isolation became a prison. Before the massacre, the family reported disturbing events. Andreas found footprints in the snow coming from the forest, but none going back. House keys disappeared, and, most sinister, there were sounds in the attic, as if someone was living up there.
On April 4th, 1922, worried neighbors went to the farm. What they found was blood-curdling. All 6 members of the family had been killed with a pickaxe, an object from the farm itself. The bodies were scattered, 4 in the barn, grandson Joseph in his crib, and the maid in her room.
The crime scene was an investigator's nightmare. There were no signs of forced entry. The family's money was untouched. The motive was not robbery. But the most shocking detail, the killer or killers remained on the farm for at least 3 days after the murders. Someone fed the cattle, ate food in the kitchen, and lit the stove. The killer was, literally, cohabiting with the dead.
The list of suspects ranged from a former lover of Victoria to Andreas himself, but no evidence was conclusive. Police even exhumed the heads of all the victims for analysis years later, to no avail. Hinterkaifeck is the perfect case study of an unsolved crime where the killer was one step away from being caught, but the crucial evidence lay in the farm's silence.
16 years of terror spread across the hills of Tuscany. The Mostro di Firenze, the monster of Florence, is a dark chapter that merged Italy's bucolic beauty with the most sadistic of violences. His targets were couples in cars, in secluded locations, during intimate moments. Between 1968 and 1985, 8 couples were attacked. The murders were brutal, but what defined the monster was the post-mortem act, the surgical removal of victims' intimate parts, an act of ritualistic desecration that suggested a deeply psychological and warped motivation, perhaps linked to a satanic cult or a desire to collect trophies. The case became an open wound in Italian culture. The fear was palpable. The monster affected social life, dating, and confidence in the night. It was a terror that came from within, not without. The Italian investigation was marked by a drama worthy of opera, egregious errors, wrongful arrests, and a whirlwind of theories. The farmer Pietro Pacciani and his friends, the so-called Lardaioli gang, were convicted based on questionable circumstantial evidence. It is believed they may have committed the crimes, but the process was so flawed that it left an immovable shadow of doubt.
Today, many experts and Italian citizens believe that the true monster was never caught. The investigative confusion, conspiracy theories, and poor handling of evidence allowed the core mystery to persist. The removal of body parts was never fully explained by the convictions. The predator's shadow still hangs over Italy, a reminder that sometimes justice prefers a convenient culprit to an uncomfortable truth.
In the late 60s, California's counterculture, fueled by the promise of peace and love, would be brutally interrupted by a media terrorist. The Zodiac was not just a killer, he was a communicator. Between 1968 and 1969, he attacked 5 confirmed victims, but the count could be much higher. His attacks, often on couples, seemed chosen to generate maximum panic. But the real horror began with the correspondence.
Zodiac sent letters to the police and San Francisco newspapers, detailing his crimes. He used a crosshair symbol and, crucially, cryptograms that he claimed contained his identity. The Z408 cryptogram was solved, but the Z340 remained a challenge for decades, revealing only disjointed phrases and a sickening motivation: to collect slaves for the afterlife.
The police had witnesses, descriptions, and evidence, but Zodiac was a ghost, changing his modus operandi and his disguise. He boasted of committing dozens of crimes, including a notorious disappearance case. Communication failures and the lack of a national fingerprint database at the time allowed him to dissolve. Modern theories about his identity are varied, from Arthur Lee Allen, the most prominent suspect, to new forensic DNA technology that recently pointed to a deceased individual. But the uncertainty persists. Zodiac used the media as his most powerful weapon. He became the first serial killer to manipulate the press, turning the silence of the solution into an eternal cry of mystery.
What links a Victorian butcher to a cryptographic psychopath in California, an Italian monster, and a shadow on a German farm. The answer lies in psychological patterns and, more sadly, in the similarities of failed investigative methods.
Common psychological patterns. All four exhibit the need for absolute power and control. Jack and the Monster of Florence committed acts of desecration. Zodiac and Jack communicated to fuel fear. The horror of the Hinterkaifeck family is that their killer reveled in the control of living with the dead.
Failures of method. In every case, the technology of the time was not up to the crime. In 1888, there was no forensic science. In 1922, local police were unprepared. In Florence and California, the lack of standardization in evidence collection and media sensationalism contaminated the investigation. Unsolved history is, in part, the history of justice's failure to evolve as quickly as malice.
Each of these cases is a link. Jack taught the world about the serial killer, forcing police to view the predator not as a common criminal, but as a continuous threat. The failure at Hinterkaifeck underscores the importance of an intact crime scene. Zodiac showed how communication with the media can be a weapon, and the Monster of Florence demonstrated the cost of judicial errors.
The list of crimes that remain in silence is vast. History is filled with enigmas that echo with the same intensity. The Springfield 3, 1992. 3 women disappear without a trace in Missouri, leaving behind only a mystery that defies logistics. The disappearance of D.B. Cooper, 1971. The hijacker who jumped from a plane with $200,000 and dissolved into the air, defying air security. The death of Elisa Lam, 2013. Although ruled accidental, the footage of her bizarre behavior in the elevator shortly before being found in a hotel's water tank with a dark past remains a modern cold case that resonates with the strangeness of older crimes.
Why, ultimately, are we so drawn to these abysses? Because the unsolved crime is a threat to our illusion of order. It reveals the fragility of the law, the imperfection of the human mind, and the possibility that the purest evil can exist without consequence. These mysteries are proof that history is a labyrinth, and some of its darkest corridors will never be illuminated. Jack the Ripper, Hinterkaifeck, the Monster, and Zodiac are not just legends. They are the reminder that somewhere the truth was buried and the killer achieved the final victory: silence. And as these echoes persist, we will continue to search, downed by the empty promise of an answer.